Welcome everybody, how is it going? I hope you are all well and ready for finishing the RFM Tiger 1 in Tunisia build. No long introduction this time, let's get right into it. You're watching Tank Brusher, 1/35th scale German armor and 3D printable part designs. First we need to finish the construction phase of the build. I did order different tow cables to display the 22mm diameter initial style cables. These ones are branded by Arbor and made from stainless steel, making them an absolute pain to work with unless you're able to heat treat them. They need to be annihilated, and that's not that easy to do actually. The copper ones from the kit would be right for displaying vehicles going up the timeline. They were switched over to 35mm diameter for the rest of the production line. For this build I have to deal with the stainless steel ones, but I am actually looking into getting some made from copper. That will be a massive quality of life improvement. Next section I would like to attend to is the rear of the vehicle. I did move the toolbox slightly to the center. Photos of the original are showing a different positioning to what RFM indicates in the manual and with the pack marks on the rear plate. Second point I have to address here are the armored covers for the exhaust outlet. I did use the wrong part in my build. The more complex shaped ones are clearly recognizable on the photos of the hull getting blown up after it broke down or was defeated in combat. But you will find them included in the kit. Speaking of me making mistakes here, I went for covered up smoke dischargers I designed by myself. The smoke dischargers were clearly not covered up. I can't even tell you where I picked this up in the first place, but yeah, this needs to be replaced again. Tiger 142 of the Abteilung 501 was not the first Tiger in Africa, it was the fourth. I sincerely apologize, at least the derivation and parts I used will be fixed before it gets placed on its vignette later down this year. Now let's move on into the painting process. I choose to black base most of my upcoming Tiger builds in order to build up more shades of the base coat gradually and in a more distressed look. More on this later. This first base coat here is done with Tamiya XF1 NATO Black and Mr. Hobby Leveling Thinner. Usually I would have used a primer and microfiller like Mr. Servicer 1200 first. To have a unified surface and good paint adhesion on photo etch parts, utilizing a primer is always a good idea. Two practical reasons I did not in this build. First, I ran out of it. And my favorite online store is dead slow at the moment, so there would be another 2-week delay aside from me already ordering the tow cables and getting a delay there. Second, I don't need to use stencils for the marking on the photo etch parts of this vehicle. Even on the plastic, the Tamiya paint was not fully up to the task of withstanding this stress, as we see later. I stay a supporter of the guys recommending a technical primer layer just by going with my experience so far. Directly after, I'm looking for opportunities to save time later on. A Tiger has about 48 tires I would have to paint with the brush. Even with the road wheel sandwich, this looked like a rather lengthy task to me. Therefore I spray paint them now, using Ammo by MIG rubber and tires. That's my favorite paint for this kind of task. Already looking ahead, this plays out very well in the end. So long for now, let's have a look into the base coat. Most, if not all, Tigers dedicated for Africa were painted in tropical camo. This paint scheme was officially issued in March 1941 and surpassed 1 year later by its second iteration. My vehicle was built in October 1942. Seems to be an obvious choice then, until reading Jentz and Doyle's book and looking at the Bovington Tiger. That one was built in 1933 while still running the very first tropical camo iteration. This conflict is down to the factory being allowed to use up old stock paint first And that exception is not even limited to the Henschel production plant at all. Figuring out stuff like this is comparably easy with Tigers, given the fact that tropical camo was used in southern Russia as well. It easily becomes a mess when we start looking at vehicles produced in larger numbers, together with dark yellow becoming a thing in early 1933. Black and white photos being of little use when it comes down to telling these apart. The chassis of a Tiger leaves me with a special challenge for an interesting looking base coat. These straight, mostly featureless and large surfaces are looking very boring to begin with, and a traditional base coat is just blunt and doesn't cut it. While a more Spanish style color modulation, for me it doesn't look like something desirable neither. That's why I go for a more distressed looking base coat, building up some saturation first by spraying a cloudy pattern and unifying everything after. Just to the point of getting full coverage but leaving different shades randomly shine through. In a second layer I repeat this, creating a tint by mixing a small amount of white into the paint. I concentrate this effect in areas where height level changes and some smaller parts like hatches, covers and the cupola itself. This leaves me at least with somewhat an impression of a color modulation going on. Tropentarn 1 is a two-tone camo pattern requiring about 1/3 of RAL 7008 grey-green sprayed over the base coat of RAL 8000. These colors do have very little contrast and are often undistinguishable on black and white photos. I think there is still a debate going on about how and if and how these very first Abteilung 501 Tigers actually looked like. What I think is safe to say is they arrived in full tropical camouflage, but naked at Falling-Bostel Troop Training Center in Germany, pretty naked accessory-wise I mean. At this time, something looking like a low contrast camouflage pattern is visible to eyes that are looking for it. Once the same tank arrives in Italy, now fully kitted out, it's ready for shipment and I can't see a camo pattern anymore. The little contrast is already either overpowered with dust and dirt or was actually never present. But what I can see clearly are some of the now present accessories being painted in a slightly darker color, supposedly RAL 7008. I mimic this by painting my stowage box accordingly. Okay, you got me here. I talk about low contrast, camouflage, and still you can see a very clear difference. This is to me mixing a bit of green into my RAL 7008. I want to boost it just a little bit due to my own preference. The best reference I can point you to is the Bovington Tiger. Me looking at footage of it and comparing it to my Stuck build made me decide to alter this hue just a little bit. By the way, the very same pots were used, but different techniques of application lead to a very different result in the end. And since I am much more interested in my collection of same class vehicles, I'm locked into my technique for the next Tropentarn Tigers I'm going to build now. For now, we need to move on having a look at the decals next in order to wrap this quite lengthy process up. RFM supplies us with two styles of numbers. It can be assumed the ones with the red infill were used by the second company of the Abteilung 501. These are the guys with the turret numbers starting with a 2. It's company, squad, vehicle. The first company had quite different infills. They had white outlines of course, but at least in some cases a slightly darker infill. Too dark for being a base coat and still too bright for being a red. Common ground is again the camo color RAL 7008 was used here. I don't like decals when I can replace them. Here I have good reason to do so. The wrong type of infill is nothing I will tolerate on this build. But once put on my transfer sheet, it's easy to judge their quality nevertheless. everything looks pretty well here. The carrier film is not too thick, silvering is not worse than on every other good quality decal I expose to my bright video lights. In this condition they all do silver. This transfer sheet now goes into my scanner. Once it's digital, it's converted into black and white and the outlines are getting traced by software. The result directly feeding my cutting machine. I use Aura Mask 810 for a masking material, and the guys with more experience here notice there is some tearing going on. The blade was gummed up with material. I fixed it again for the next project. For the bar crosses I use some pre-made masks by Eduard. The bar crosses are rather large and extend underneath the track guards on some of these vehicles in this company. Applying the stencils takes some time and is nothing that should be hasted at all. In a wider view, stencils are, in my opinion at least, much superior to decals for two reasons. First, the white of a decal is a titanium white. It is much too bright to represent actual whites used back in those days. Me and you are getting much better results using off-white instead. And the second reason, decals are simply too perfect in shape, alignment and size. Very often bar crosses and turret number are a little bit crooked and outlines not too perfectly aligned or straight at all. Spraying a two-layer stencil like these here will take care of all of this by its own. I'm not saying it's okay to work lazy or it's okay to do a neglecting job, just saying it needs to look more organic in the end. Larger imperfections like the ones you can spot here are taken care of during the detail painting phase coming up next. But before I move on, let's have a real close look at the area masked off for the bar crosses. You can see punctual failure of the paint adhering to the bare plastic surface. My advice is going both ways, using a primer first and removing some of the tackiness of board stencils before applying them. So far so good. I had no issues with the Aura mask in my experience so far, but now let's move on. Okay, time to break out the wet palette. In case you're in the market for one, I can highly recommend the ones made by Redgrass Games. A wet palette more or less allows us to work with our favorite water-based acrylics for an extended period of time and makes mixing hues very easy and effective. But actually, let me do this in a separate video and stay on topic for now. First I have to attend to the tires. 48 pieces. Thanks to the previous work done with the airbrush, this task was over in 10 minutes, something I will keep in mind for the upcoming builds. Next color I use regular is old wood, either by Ammo or Vallejo. Whatever I find first, I like both hues. Painting all wooden parts, tools, tow cables are now getting a fast treatment in gray. Two more things I do not show in full detail. I did build up some definition on the two bags covering the guns using the wet blending technique, and I fixed some smaller defects by quickly mixing up a base color equivalent. Now this should get us right into the weathering phase. This vehicle will share a base with its slightly older brother, issued to the Abteilung 502 in Russia in 1942, each of them having their own small vignette, but yet placed in context to each other. Till here I had to keep most of my models stored in boxes. I'm finally moving now and getting a huge upgrade in modeling space and the opportunity to display some of my stuff. Therefore I want to keep my options for a vignette open. Finally can do some diorama work here. AKA placing the environment first and making the vehicle then part of it. In order to do so, I need to keep the lower third of this vehicle free from final effects. Nevertheless, there are some areas I can work on now and show you at least in some detail. Starting with the hidden areas behind the road wheels and tracks, I use Ammo by MiG Heavy Mud, turned earth here, applying it generously and using it to glue on some garden dirt. Took me actually a while to adapt using real dirt In the end, it has a slightly better corn size when compared to pure pigment or weathering powders. That's what I'm after. Too large of corns are easily being brushed off after the whole thing dries. I did prepare my tracks accordingly to the video I already made. Since they are workable, it's easy to remove them again and make them interact with the ground of the vignette later. There is no additional work done here. For the weathering, I do work section by sections and I work in layers, starting with Africa core wash, using it for streaking on the wood grain on the tools as well as the traditional pin wash. For getting the wooden handles, I let it dry for a few minutes before streaking it with enamel odorless thinner. Usually it's enough to start with the tool, do the pin wash of the section I work on, and then I come back to the tool, reserving something like a workflow. It plays out better to do it at 2 layers on the tools. You're not blind when doing this stuff, you know when to come back, I think. Next color I work with here on the main deck is Abteilung 502 Industrial Earth. It's one of my favorite brown tones for weathering, together with Ammo by Mick Earth out of the Nature Effect series. First, I'm outlining all features present. I try to get more or less both at the same time a faked shadow underneath the tool as well as a more or less heavy dirt deposit. To make this look good, it needs some blending, of course. Unloaded brush, damp and odorless thinner, I blend the oils into the open surface. The blending is done again in 2 or 3 steps in order to get rid of this hairy look from some of the pigments floating in the odorless thinner. That's a turpentine oil if you wonder. Switching sections now to the turret. Here I can show you a sloped surface I treat with streaks in direction of imaginary water flowing. The bright color is North Africa Dust by Ammo by Mick. The higher I go up, the less dark brown tones I use. This is why I only use the African Dust here on the horizontal area. Applying it in patches first and then blending it in a stippling motion directly after. Be aware these enamel products do dry much faster than the oils do. Back to the main deck section, doing the same step now with the dust effect. On the further out section I did use a speckling method to build up more layers of dirt. I showed it to a few guys before dedicating to doing it on all sections, and we all agreed to better abandon this idea. It would fit better for a vehicle that was operating somewhere else in richer earth. Just mentioning it to give you guys the full picture. Vertical surface are treated with the same dust product, but streaking instead of blending. Going a bit more minimalistic works very well for this vehicle because it was relatively new back then, and photos are showing them only being dirty when they arrived in Africa. Together with the already very irregular base coat, none of the surface do look unattended to. The rear deck I want to be open for interaction with the vignette again, as well as the complete rear wall of the hull. Therefore it's better to leave these sections to when it really counts to do them properly. And this already leaves me to wrapping up so far for this build. I know and fully understand that this might not fully satisfy all of your thirst for hardcore weathering techniques. For the future, weathering will be less and less a thing I cover in depth, leaving it to the guys who are all about this topic and can explain it much better basically. I will focus broadly on the vehicle itself, its historical context, and me designing parts to make them more unique and more accurate in detail. Coming back to weathering only when I have actually something to show and worth talking about. I hope you enjoyed the work done here. If so, please don't forget to subscribe. I'm back in 2 weeks from now. Till then, see you. Happy modeling.